Tell them that you're very thankful for what they do for us.
That was good. A lesson and a practical application. The Titanic has come up in conversation several times recently in my vehicle. The kids and I have strange conversations anyway, but I think they had talked about the Titanic at school, and it had been a question during one of the academic team practices, and then we got in the car one day and they were discussing the Titanic on the radio. And I know Benjamin's really interested in the Titanic. When I was his age, I was fascinated by it. That was before that movie came out. Kind of ruined it for me. I was not a fan of that movie. But I used to study the Titanic and the things that happened and the people that were on board and all these things. And as we were discussing some of their questions, some of those things came back, and they're talking about it on the radio, and we're discussing what they could have done differently. And for that ship to sink, if you haven't seen the movie, sorry if I just spoiled the ending for you. But for that ship to sink, it was just a series of wrong moves that any one of which, if they had done things differently, the ship, there's a good likelihood the ship would not have sank. From if they had lookouts where they were supposed to have lookouts, things would have been better. If they had hit the iceberg head on instead of trying to turn at the last minute, it would have done less damage and the ship might have not sank. Down to the issue that if they had had enough lifeboats, even if it sank, they wouldn't have lost as many people. But they didn't have enough lifeboats as it was, and they decided the ship's not going anywhere. We're not even going to load the lifeboats full. So a lot of people died unnecessarily. And because of the string of events that led to the ship sinking, it's hard to pinpoint one thing and say, well, that was the cause. That was the root of this. That's why this was such a big deal as far as what they did that night. All of those decisions, though, that led to the ship sinking can be traced back to one catastrophic mistake. And that's when the people who designed the ship, the people who built the ship, the people who promoted the ship, and the people who operated the ship all decided this ship cannot sink. When they went into it thinking it can't happen to us, that's when everything went wrong. Because all of these other decisions they made were based on that prideful assumption that it can't sink. We know from hindsight that that's not true. The ship very much could sink and did. But if they'd stopped and thought about it, anything that is heavier than the water, anything that's denser than the water, you put metal in the water, if enough of the right circumstances line up, that ship can sink. But they were all convinced it could never happen to us. It could never happen to this ship. And so a lot of things were done recklessly. The Apostle Paul deals with a similar set of circumstances when it comes to our spiritual life as we come into 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you're a guest with us this morning, we've been doing a series of studying piece by piece through the book of 1 Corinthians. And so we find ourselves this morning at chapter 10 where Paul deals with this issue of moral failure and addressing the underlying thought of the Corinthians. No, it can't happen to me. It can't happen to me. And all you have to do today is go on Netflix or Hulu or any streaming service, and I can just about guarantee you they've got at least one documentary about a church leader somewhere who thought, oh, it can't happen to me, and now is involved in some kind of scandal where they've got their own show on Hulu. When we think it can't happen to us, that's when we set ourselves up for failure. That's what we're going to look at this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you turn there with me, if you haven't already, go ahead and turn there with me so we can read together. And once you find it, if you'd stand with me as we read together from God's Word. If you can't find it or don't have your Bible with you this morning, it will be on the screen for you. But we're going to look at the first 13 verses of this chapter and see what Paul says as he's addressing these people about the very real danger that, yes, moral and spiritual failure can happen to you. He says, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all drank the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them for an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." And you may be seated. So remember last week, if you were here with us, that Paul's talking to the Corinthians about the need to protect their witness. He said some things last week at the end of chapter 9 that, if we take by themselves, sound like he's talking about salvation and having to earn salvation, or the possibility of losing salvation. But when we read everything we've studied in context, we realize that what he's talking about is their witness, their ability to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and have some credibility with the people that are listening to them because of the lives that they lead. And he talks about protecting that. And he talks about not disqualifying themselves, needing to live in such a way that they don't disqualify themselves. Then he comes here and he's using this as an example to the Corinthians of what it would look like to disqualify ourselves, of what it would look like to fall and stumble into something that would keep us from being the kind of witness that God has designed us to be, the kind of witness that we want to be for Jesus Christ. The Corinthians also, keep in mind, we've studied way back through this book several times. He's talked about them not getting involved in the pagan feasts and the festivities at the temples. And some of them had the mindset of saying, I can go, I'm spiritually strong, it's not going to bother me. If I go and I'm there for the festivities, it's not going to bother me, it's not going to affect me. And Paul's attitude was, okay, let's set that aside for the sake of argument and say, sure, it's not going to affect you, although we know it will. But let's say it's not going to affect you, it's going to affect others and the way they perceive you and the way they perceive the gospel. So he's talking to these people who say, oh, I can go and participate in sort of the trappings of paganism. I can, when it comes to living like the world, I can get my toe right up to that line, and I'll be fine. I know when to stop and not step over that line. He's talking to the Corinthian believers who thought that they could be like the world without it actually making them be like the world. Does that make sense? That they could live and participate in worldly things without becoming worldly themselves. And he basically says, let me tell you a story. And he reminds them about the people of Israel. Now, I think it's interesting, too, that he says in chapter 10, verse 1, our fathers were under the cloud. He's talking to a church of people who were mostly from a Greek and Roman pagan background. These were not Jewish people who had come to Christ. These were the pagans. These were the Gentiles. And then they came to Christ. And now he says they're our fathers. He's making the point to them that you are now part of Israel. Not that you're Jewish now, but you have been brought into a covenant relationship with the God of Israel. And you're every bit as much of that part of that covenant as I, Paul, am, who was a Pharisee, who was circumcised, who studied under the law. You're every bit as much part of a covenant relationship with the God of Israel as I am, and that God demands our total allegiance. So don't miss that when he says our fathers. He doesn't say my father. He doesn't say their father, their fathers. He's including them in the spiritual heritage of Israel. But he uses those people of Israel as an example that even God's people are not immune to moral and spiritual failure if we let our guard down. We look in those first verses, he uses Israel as an example of those who've experienced the grace of God. And they've experienced it firsthand, and they've experienced it in numerous powerful ways. And he lists some of those ways. As a matter of fact, this is common throughout the Old Testament and somewhat into the New Testament. This is a common thing among God's people to sort of make a list of the ways that God has taken care of us. That would not be a bad thing to do any time of the year, but particularly as we're coming out of the Thanksgiving season. You and I could each go back over our lives and make a list of the ways that God has taken care of us and provided for us. No matter how dire our circumstances may be, God's provision and protection are still evident if we look for it. So he's telling the people about how Israel had experienced the grace of God. These people as a group had experienced the grace of God firsthand, and yet they still were able to stumble into pagan idolatry, and they were still able to participate and embrace the paganism of those around them. Now the point there is not shame on the pagans around them. The point is shame on them for making the choices that they made. And some of the ways they had experienced the grace of God, they had experienced God's presence. He talks about the cloud here. When he's talking about the cloud, that's in the book of Exodus, where they're coming out of Egypt after being released from slavery. And God led them by a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. It's a symbol of God's presence being among the people of Israel, that He led them Himself. And there was this visible cloud as a representation of that. And He said all these people that we're talking about, they experienced the presence of God. They experienced the cloud leading them. It's not the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the people who followed the cloud who fell. It was the people who followed the cloud themselves. Also in verses 1 and 2, he talks about the sea being parted. They experienced God's protection. Each of these things that they experience starts with a P in Adrian Rogers fashion. It just lined up that way. But they experienced God's presence and God's protection. When they came to the sea, that's when Pharaoh's army caught up with them. So they've got this army that's out for blood behind them. They've got the sea in front of them. They don't know what they're supposed to do. And God suddenly parts the waters for them to pass through on dry land. And they experience God sparing them from being slaughtered by the Egyptians. And so these people that we're talking about, they had experienced the protection of God firsthand as He has done something miraculous in order to save them. Then in verse 3, we see God's provision for them. They all ate the same spiritual food. God provided manna for them in the wilderness. They were wandering around in a desert area. I've heard skeptics say it just doesn't make sense that many people could wander around in that arid and barren an area for 40 years. How could they survive? How could they find enough provisions to support that kind of population? Well, that's really not a skeptical argument, because the Israelites had that same concern, and the Bible explains how God provided those things for them supernaturally. It says that God provided manna. He rained down food for them. And so they had experienced God's provision, that every day they woke up and exactly what they needed for that day, God had provided. Now God provides for us, but they got to see this. I mean, it's like I walked out every morning and there were tacos in my front yard. I would have every reason to praise the Lord for that, right? It wasn't tacos, but they walked out and exactly what they needed was there right in front of them, and they couldn't have provided that. It was God. Then there's the water from the rock, which again is God's provision. But Paul makes the point here that they were drinking from a spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. And that's part of the purpose of striking the rock and speaking to the rock and the living water coming out. It was supposed to be a picture of Christ for them to understand when He came. So the fact that he ties this in with Christ tells us it's not just God's provision, it's God's promise. This was a sign of their covenant with God. It was a sign of God's ultimate fulfillment of that covenant through Jesus Christ. And so just in the span of a few short weeks here, this group of people has experienced more miraculous events, more times that God showed up and showed off than most people experience in their entire lives, at least to this extent. They were walking with God in a closeness that we can only dream about, as far as seeing right in front of us how it shows up tangibly. They were experiencing God right there with them. This was God's grace. And we would think, okay, with this relationship, with this understanding of God, surely these people would be so close to Him that they could not fall. Because they know what they've seen, they know what they've heard, they know what they've experienced. And yet verse 5 tells us that many of them still fell into pagan idolatry and suffered the consequences. They all experienced all the things that are spelled out in the first 4 verses, but verse 5 says, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased. God was upset with not just even a few of them, God was upset with the majority of them. And why is that? It's because even though all of them experienced this grace, the majority of them